Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So recently, I was looking to upgrade from my Nikon DSLR, and while searching to find a budget price 4K camera, I stumbled upon a great deal for the Lumix G7, and in my opinion, the Lumix G7 is one of the best budget 4K cameras you can buy now. So while the Lumix G7 can be used for photography, I'll be focusing on the video aspect of the camera, but you shouldn't really buy the camera for photos anyways, since 16 megapixels isn't very attractive nowadays, considering some phones already have that many megapixels. But either way, let's get into the review. So the biggest selling point of this camera is the micro four thirds sensor, which can record 4K at an extreme budget. This camera cost me around 400 bucks, and you can buy actually a new one on Amazon, but I did buy this one used, and it is a lot lighter than any other camera I've used before. It's smaller than my Nikon DSLR, and my lenses are also more compact because of the micro four thirds sensor. So this camera has a 16 megapixel 4K sensor. The camera is made by Panasonic, and since the sensor is a micro four thirds sensor, it is completely mirrorless. But one thing to note is it is a cropped sensor, so it technically has worse low light performance. But the thing about the low light performance is that the noise is not as bad as a DSLR. So in low light situations, the noise is not RGB dots all over the place, but instead it's more of a static, a grayscale static. One thing that really surprised me when I first touched this camera is how light and compact it was. It's pretty much the lightest camera I've used, apart from some point and shoot cameras. It's also made of metal and plastic, and it's way smaller than a normal DSLR, mostly due to the micro four thirds sensor. This camera also has some pretty nice batteries. They're each 1200 milliamp hours, and they last a pretty long time when shooting. One of my bigger issues with this camera is that it doesn't have built-in stabilization within the sensor. So the lenses do actually have stabilization, and this camera relies on lenses that do have stabilization. So using manual lenses or lenses that aren't smart per se isn't very optimal when using this camera. Now here's the biggest downside of this camera. The autofocus absolutely sucks when recording at 4K specifically. I found that at 1080p it wasn't so bad, but when you're recording in 4K, the autofocus absolutely sucks. However, you can kind of get around this by using 49 area autofocus, which is the fastest this camera allows. And also, face tracking does work pretty decently in all modes, but it's obviously a lot slower at 4K. So in general, 1080p is the most optimal resolution for autofocus, but the problem is, this camera is mostly aimed at people who want to record 4K. So it is a bit of an issue, and I don't really like it, but it is manageable. It's just a little bit slow. Another issue with recording in 4K, or basically any resolution on this camera, is that the clips are split up after 5 minutes. So you're required to sync the clips after 5 minutes in post, and 2 frames of the recording. When you start a new clip after 5 minutes, the recording will have 2 frames that are black, and nothing will be recorded, which is a problem because if you're recording audio, the audio will go ahead of the actual video, so your audio will be out of sync, which is a bit of a problem, and you can't really bypass it because it's just a thing with the way this camera handles storage. And another limit on top of the 5-minute limit is the 30-minute record limit of clips in general. So this camera only continuously allows you to record up to 30 minutes. Now the good news about this one is it can be bypassed with a few hacks to the firmware, and I heard there's also a service mode you can probably enable to allow you to bypass that as well. Now let's talk about the camera itself, the body of the camera. So the camera has very premium dials and buttons and knobs on it. They're very well laid out. There's also up to 5 custom function buttons on this camera, which is extremely useful because you can program them to basically anything in the camera. So if you want a button for white balance, here you go, you just program it up and it's good. Another great feature, and there's actually 2 features, but the first one is the flip out screen, and this is my favorite feature of this camera, and this is one feature that my DSLR definitely did not have. This flip out screen is amazing. It's not like the Sony screens, which are partially flippable. This camera has a completely swivel 360 degree flip out screen, and this is very helpful because you can actually see what you're filming at unusual angles, and also just in general easier to see the actual clip you're filming. So it's an amazing feature, especially if you're standing in front of the camera. It's also touchscreen, and it's covered with glass, which is amazing because it's one of the more premium displays I've seen, specifically in Canon DSLRs. They look a little bit more cheap, but the whole cover of the display is glass, so it looks pretty nice. There's another feature, and this comes with all cameras that have a mirrorless design, and that is the digital viewfinder. So with this digital viewfinder, it is pretty amazing to use this after using a DSLR for a long time. Basically, you can see exactly the image you're filming through that digital viewfinder. In DSLRs, you'll see a version of the image. You'll see what you're filming, but you won't see the shutter speed or the f-stop really take effect. But in this camera, you can see exactly what you're filming, and it's very nice. The display inside the digital viewfinder is very clear and very bright, so you can see the exact exact image, and in general, it's a very helpful feature when you're shooting. You can even look through it when you're filming video. So yeah, I do like this camera so far, but there's one more thing, and that is the software. Now the software, in my opinion, yes, I actually really do like the software. It's a very easy menu system. It has 4 tabs within the menu system, and every single item that you hover over in the menu has a description. So everything has a description. You don't have to use any external manual unless you really don't know what something is. But yeah, it's a really, really good feature, and I really like the menu system. It's very clean and very well organized. And the last feature of this camera is one of the ones that I actually purchased this camera for, and that is it has color profile selection. So my DSLR didn't have this feature, so I couldn't shoot with any higher dynamic range profiles or any log profiles because there were none to select. But in this camera, you have a pretty big range of them. There is scenery, there's natural, normal, and Cinelike D. And my favorite of all of these is Cinelike D because it allows you to preserve a lot of dynamic range when you're filming, which is amazing. The only thing is you're going to need to do some color grading and color correction in post-production, but it's really worth it because you'll get that amazing dynamic range. Now, there's one downside with this camera in terms of color profiles, and that's that it doesn't include any log profiles. So the only thing you'll have to preserve more dynamic range is Cinelike D, but I actually have made a custom log type profile for this camera, and actually followed a video. You'll see card up on the screen right now, and also in the description I'll have a link down below. There's basically a tutorial if you want to check it out for how to create your sort of log profile for this camera. But yeah, in general, this camera is very well suited for filming 4K, except for autofocus. That's probably the biggest thing you're gonna have to keep in mind if you're planning on purchasing this camera. But all in all, I'm pretty happy with this camera, especially for the price I managed to grab it at. The small form factor, light body, long battery life, and accurate, albeit slow at 4K. Even 1080p, it's a little bit slow. The autofocus makes this camera quite a steal when it comes to buying any budget 4K camera. So anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, then make sure to subscribe. And if you... Oh, whoa, I totally failed that. Let's try that again. Okay. Anyways, guys, thank you for watching this video. If you liked the video, make sure to leave a like. And if you really liked it, then make sure to subscribe. Anyways, guys, I'm out. I'll see you in the next one.